So thank you very much for everyone to join us. I mean, this is again going to be a very interesting conversation on sustainable investment in the mining sector. This time, dedicated to Mexico. I wanted right away to start by thanking our panelists here, that you actually can find that description on this invitation, from Adam McEniry, formerly from First Majestic Silver, Nat Mac & Co. Armando Ortega, that used to be president at Cancham, in his country manager at Newgold. Ralph Shearing is with us from Vancouver, early morning in Vancouver, as always. That's the problem when you live in Vancouver, but from Altaley Mining Corporation. And Dr. David Sarquis from Universidad del Mar in Oaxaca, that actually helps me set the stage on political issues and socioeconomic issues in Mexico, beyond the mere mining sector, but to understand how this impacts the situation in the country. And so, I mean, without further ado, I mean, I just want to replace this webinar in terms of what we're trying to achieve for the last few weeks and months. It's a webinar of which we address different countries, trying to look at ESG best practices that can be replicated, that already exist, and try to highlight a series of different above the ground risks that mining companies and mining investors and stakeholders need to be aware of, to have a better understanding of how mining could be included into a project of inclusive development in different jurisdictions. Mexico being a very specific one, one with a very long history of mining, obviously, with mining being important in terms of its economy, relative weight, but not as much as in terms of relative weight as in Peru, for example, and with a very strong power in Mexico City, with AMLO, who's arriving to the second part of his sexenio just after the election on June 6th. And we thought that it was actually a good and interesting opportunity to try to discuss indeed the state of mining investment in Mexico, the actors involved, the challenges and opportunities there, and try to highlight some of the best practices that have been done and could be replicated for the interest of our viewership and people that will are either listening now, or as often now much more downloading the video afterwards and listening to the conversation on sustainable investment in mining sector and the state of the mining sector in Mexico. So maybe just without further ado, I'll start maybe by turning to David first. David, I just wanted maybe to engage with you. I mean, I just lived 2 years in Mexico, so you know much more about Mexican politics and the structure of how the interaction between the administration, let's say the MX, and the different regions work. Can I maybe ask you just to for our viewership to just help me set the stage in terms of the situation in Mexico currently, the recent elections, and what that would mean, especially for the mining sector in the second time?
Yes, sure. Glad to be here. Thank you, Remi, and thanks to the rest of you for participating in this panel. I would say that in order to understand the specifics of the mining sector and mining policy in the last 3 years, you would have to look at the overall theme of AMLO's energy policy on the whole. He, even before he took office as a candidate, he clearly announced that he had a sympathy for oil and for strengthening the country's control in the energy area. So it's not been too much of a surprise that a lot of these policies have turned their back on some of the renewables. And he has tried to strengthen state control through the state monopolies of Pemex and the Federal Electricity Commission. In that sense, his mining policy was also announced before it started, because he belongs to a group of critics of the law changes made by Peña Nieto in 2012, but also of the mining law that was approved since 1994. And criticism basically points at very long-term concessions, environmental damage, labor exploitation, and few revenue benefits for the country. So that's something that had been on the table even before he became president. A lot of people in Mexico and elsewhere were concerned that these views would have a very strong impact in the economy and direction of the country. But the truth is that they haven't really all that much, because all in all, in spite of his authoritarian leftist views, López Obrador is well aware of the fact that he needs to keep a good interaction with foreign investment in general and local capital. So in spite of these strong rhetoric against liberalism in general, like neoliberalism, he has to abide by the legal structure still valid in the country and the needs of the economic sector. So there have been a couple of projects to modify the law, but they have been put on hold. My impression is he uses them as a sort of a boogeyman, and that frankly, he's much more interested in carving a historical image of himself for posterity than in actually changing the course of the economy and the nation.
Yeah, and this is a mix of a series of dichotomy that we see throughout Latin America of, leaders that sometimes elected on an anti-mining platform. I'm thinking about Ollanta Humala in Peru, or even, some cases Lula in Brazil a long time ago, that turned out to be actually, administration with whom you can work decently, because they understand that it will be too costly for the overall country to, take a deep dip at the sector and understand also the positive impact for the economy. So using it as a kind of an electoral discourse and a scapegoat at that point. But then, when it comes to the actual project, and that's what we've seen indeed in Mexico, and that will be maybe my transition to Armando, that didn't prevent the capacity to actually move forward with, a sound, mining sectors, obviously, some new conversations sometimes on elements of how to operate well in Mexico didn't go beyond the narrative. And maybe, if you can help me, Armando, get a better sense, of what are the main actors in the mining sectors in Mexico, and especially the Canadian investors that are present in the country, and what I've been able to achieve in terms of building the sector. That'd be wonderful. Thank you, Armando.
Thank you, Remi, and good morning, everybody. Well, yes, Canadian investments in mining are very important because they do represent the largest share of foreign investment in the sector. More than 60%, probably close to 70%, are related to Canadian investment. And these investments started to land in Mexico when the old mining law was replaced in year 1992 with a new mining law that opened up fully for foreign participation in the country. And Canadians took the opportunity, and we have had in the last 30 years, in the last 25 years, more than 200 Canadian companies that have formally incorporated Mexican companies, because that is what the law says. And most of them have been juniors that have explored several assets, and then, as you know, the method, they sell it to another one through the exchange. And right now, I would say that the first contribution by Canadian investment, with the benefit of hindsight, purely on the mining side of production, in particular for precious metals, is that they have helped the country to keep the #1 rank as the world leading silver producer. It's a place that has been disputed by, for example, Peru. Mm-hmm. Well, thanks to Canadian investment, again, particularly on precious metals, Mexico has kept that rank as the first silver producer. And before Canada came here to Mexico, Mexico was totally out of the picture regarding gold producer. And after that, now we are probably number 6 or number 7, depending the year, as a real player of gold production. And similarly, we could also say that it has also happened regarding industrial metals like copper, like zinc, molybdenum, etc. So that has been the contribution simply on the pure mining side as such. I would say that the second contribution, and we can talk later about this, has been regarding the new bar that Canada has brought to Mexico. It has raised the bar regarding crucial standard for mining operation. That has been the second contribution. We could later talk about this in detail. I would say that in general, regarding the remarks by David and by you, Remi, the current environment in Mexico is pretty challenging because we have not the most friendly government and their political allies regarding mining, despite the long history of Mexico on mining. And this is related to a nationalistic view, and in particular antagonist, at least in general, regarding foreign investment. Mm-hmm. It is related to the history of Mexico, to the Spanish colonial times, etc. So challenging times, and yes, in particular, the day-to-day operations of a mine, permits, environmental impact statements, change of land use, water rights, etc. And of course, there is also a big challenge regarding our presence in the communities, because there are very active anti-mining groups that are always smart enough to ignite some problems. Some of them are of an artificial nature. Some of them might have a true cause of a concern. But I would say that by and large, that has not impeded that many Canadian companies are up and running. For example, just this year, the main investors on the sector will be Canadian companies like Torex in Guerrero, like Max Silver together with Fresnillo in Zacatecas, with Juanicipio, etc. So we have Agnico Eagle, Alamos, all of them have important projects that are leading projects. And in total, we are talking about $1+ billion of investment simply for year 2021.
Yeah, you include indeed a series of very interesting elements, and indeed, I mean, recently in Colorado there was an interesting 2 conferences on precious metals, and another one on gold, mentioning opportunities in different commodities, especially in silver, as you're mentioning, with new potential use of silver in the industrial space. That makes it very interesting to potentially look at it. You mentioned Torex Gold, a very well run company recently in terms of its vision with the specific about the grand risk. What I was specifically interested in terms of, you mentioned, that allows me to transition to Adam is indeed the type of sometimes challenging environment in terms of above the ground risk and in terms of land use specifically. Mexico is a very diverse country to start with. I mean, we're quite arrogant of thinking that we're going to be talking about everything in Mexico. That's not the objective here, but just to give some leads of specific troublesome issues that needs to be mitigated, or opportunities. And I thank you actually, Armando, for mentioning a series of them already. Maybe we can dive deeper with a specific question. But when I turn to you, Adam, on the question of land use and being able to try to navigate through the process, the legal process, the specific sets of challenges of socioeconomic and above ground risk in different places in Mexico, can you give us a little bit your sense of how it is to operate in Mexico? Very large question for a very simple end to it, but give us some key clues of what you've seen as opposed to other jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll frame my answer for those who may not be as familiar with Mexico as some of my colleagues. I think, it's always important to recognize that between countries and their resource sectors, there are often broad similarities as well as unique dynamics at play. In the case of Mexico, this is particularly so in my appreciation. It really is a country of regions. Author Luis Casagrande famously described what he called the 5 Mexicos, or the 5 nations of Mexico. Suffice to say that there are very significant differences in the investment and operating environment across the country. Painting a large swath, northern Mexico, generally more arid, less densely populated. Mining, as well as later ranching, drove its colonial settlement, culturally and ethically more European than the South. Surface issues there tend to revolve mostly around economic benefits and perhaps competition for water with ranching, agricultural interests. Southern Mexico, more humid and indigenous rooted, greater eco-sensitivities, modern industrial mining more foreign there. It's no secret that generally speaking, it's more challenging to develop projects in the South. Of course, there's the dynamic of cartels and criminality, which is there's a concern, but that also varies very much by state and region. It's quite acute in certain coastal port regions and states and border areas, and considerably less so elsewhere in Mexico. Also depends on the flare-ups and flare-downs of competition amongst groups. The collectively owned ejido land structure in much of rural Mexico also adds to complexity in negotiating land access and use agreements. You might have a couple hundred people trying to come to an agreement within themselves before they'll put a position before a company. So you have to allot perhaps more time dealing with ejidos than you may have to allot in land negotiations elsewhere under ceteris paribus conditions. And while consensus is not required within ejidos, it often becomes a political and a faction wants to a quicker agreement and one that's holding out perhaps for benefits. Mexico is a country where I found a very strong willingness of state officials to engage and provide support for the company. Preface that I was there, largely prior to AMLO under the pre and pan governments, but certainly very approachable officials. I was on the CAMIMEX, the Mexican Mining Chamber Board of Directors, and I found my Mexican colleagues, they're very open and supportive. Mining is extremely important in Mexico, about 8% of the GDP and 350,000 people employed in the sector. So as I think David and Armando, yourself, we're saying, there might be rhetoric by the government to play hard against the foreign investors, but
there is a structural place. There's a structural place for the sector, and
they need a healthy mining sector. Yeah,
absolutely, and that actually allows me maybe to transition to Ralph. You did mention a large list of socioeconomic elements, understanding how ejidos work specifically and unique structure in Mexico as opposed to specific countries that are very much tied to the community relation that you need to put in place when you're licensing a project. But when we're looking at mining under Manuel López Obrador and the kind of structural constituency of the importance of the sector, with that the existence of a key text recently apart maybe from the royalty disbursements model that we can maybe address in the second part of this webinar. My question was maybe geared to you, Ralph. You actually operate both in Guerrero and Durango, if I'm not wrong, in terms of the different levels of project that you have. It's two very unique different jurisdictions. I would just have a very open-ended question, which is how is it different from Guerrero to Durango, so that you can actually highlight some elements that you think are very important to bring out to the understanding of people that look at trying to sustainably invest in a mining sector that will create inclusive development down the road. Please share your insights. That'd be great.
Thanks, Remy. First off, I would say Adam's very correct. In Mexico, different regions, different people, different challenges in various parts of the country. So, we've been very active in Durango for quite a while. We've been developing our Tawahueto project there over a long period of time, exploring it when we had money and trying to raise money when the markets were hard without being able to move it forward. But in any event, Durango, to start off, is a very favorable area to work. It embraces mining. It's got a long mining history. And, we've had very little difficulty in our exploration and development of that project. We make a conscious effort of always, treating the local residents well, making them a part of the operation. We hire locally whenever we can and whenever, as much as possible. But it's a different mindset in Durango than in, say, Guerrero or even the southern states, although I've not worked in the southern states before. But it's quite different. I mean, people in the local residents in Durango seem to embrace and want to help you. Whereas in Guerrero, it's not quite the same. I mean, obviously the local nearest community to our project in Guerrero is Arcilla, and we have a large presence in Arcilla. We employ a lot of people. We have training programs to help people learn how to become miners. We buy locally as much as possible. So we really try to support the communities, and that's a social license issue that mining companies have to be aware of and have to work towards. But you still have a different mentality down there. So, there is cartel influence. I mean, everybody recognizes that. We don't want to highlight that because we are able to work. And, it's really a lot of working through the communities, making them a part of our operations as much as possible, and dealing with the issues as they come up. And if you talk about issues, we've had a few issues in Cancham. In fact, we shut the mine down in 2019, primarily for low zinc prices, but there was also some influences that we were getting from certain members of the community that were detrimental to, not directly to the company, but to the local residents that work for us. So with those two issues, we decided to shut the mine down for 6 months, and because really we weren't making any money. And that kind of helped the situation starting back up again. So, we started up again in early 2020, and things have gone pretty well ever since. So,
I mean, yeah. Continue, please. I make some comments afterwards, but I don't want to cut you because that was interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very real that there's a different population, a different mentality from the various areas to work. And as challenging as Guerrero is known to be, we can still work there, and a lot of mining companies work there very successfully. It doesn't stop you from working. It just means you have to be a little bit more aware. You have to put a few more people on the community relations side and working with the communities than you would necessarily up in Durango.
And that reinforces, I mean, some of the elements that we brought on conversation in the past, and for investors in terms of being able to quantify, the risk that there is in jurisdiction, not to limit itself at the national level, but to really understand the differences. Durango is a mining, very interesting in terms of mining and sustainability of mining investment. It's not the case in other jurisdictions, and even in specific regions, you can have good projects and bad projects. So it's very important to drill down and not just limit yourself to large macro data at the national level. I like what you were mentioning, especially in terms of interacting with the other risks, such as security risks. I mean, there are cartel activity in different parts of Mexico. Everybody knows this. There's no point of denying it. Usually, the best way to address it is if there's, in terms of its impact, when you're actually under the presence of a cartel, it's actually usually better than when you're actually in between two cartels for competition for territory. But even in that case, if you actually have good relation with your communities, your community becomes your own protector, in the sense that you actually have respectful relationship with, maybe informal miners to a certain some projects, other that don't have to be informal miners, but are community actors that will be your own ambassador representative towards other, let's say, informal stakeholders out there, and will not, will allow you not to have to interact with them and just have like a de facto kind of a carte blanche to continue your operation, because you are in the best interest of the economic growth of the territory. And if I'm completely rational and cynical, actually is better than you have economic development in the region where they operate. But there's also an understanding of being able to work respectfully and continue on the possibilities of mining. Now, yet again, just maybe turning to David for a larger element of regional impact, and maybe the political calendar that arrived. We've seen on June 6th a very interesting election, because AMLO remain extremely popular as opposed to other head of states in the world, because of his capacity to relate with the population, because of maybe the history of corruption that there has been on other past administrations, which we have to underline also. Has actually lost his supermajority in Congress, so that limits his capacity to do key texts and key reforms, but maintain a strong grip on much more the regional level, the governor level, with a series of governors that were elected from the MORENA party, especially in region. I mean, Guerrero is one of them, if I'm not wrong. Sonora also, Sinaloa, other places where you do have interesting fact, which is the elections of MORENA governor that will continue therefore after the sexenio, in terms that actually provides a permanency of the MORENA party after, if AMLO doesn't stay in power at the end of his term. That was again a very long sentence, but can you give us like some more perspective maybe on the role of local actors in politics in Mexico, and what that can mean also for the mining or energy sector, since we do a lot of work in energy also, that might be interesting for some of our listeners.
Right. I think it's definitely important to realize that there are several regions in Mexico, different populations, and therefore different challenges. The southern part of the country is the part that has the largest amount of native Mexicans. So you still have a lot of native communities, different tribes and different forms of organization, but basically all of them collective. So therefore it's no surprise that AMLO's stronger base comes from the population of the South. And a lot of it from the native population. That should not really be much of a problem, because in spite of the fact that within Mexico, there is a distance between the North and the South, you could use that to your own advantage, because the North, for example, tends to have more of a civil society, where people are more involved in individual discussions regarding the political system and the model to follow and all that. Whereas in the South, there tends to be more of a lining up with the leader of the tribal community, which still exists here. And therefore, the problem is just knowing who to talk to when you come down this part. Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca, is currently one of the states where mining has grown in the South, more so than other states, not only because it has the resources, the mineral resources, but also because the people who come down here picked up on that idea and have talked to the leaders of the communities, which is people that you have to be in good terms with, rather than with civil society as a whole. As you mentioned, MORENA, López Obrador's party, is now ruling half the states in the country, and that strengthens his base of power. Now, some people may think that this could be a problem in terms of how demanding they will be of the distribution of wealth in the country. But I don't see it as much of a problem, because actually the fact that you have this number of state governorships under your control strengthens the base of an authoritarian regime. Because one thing that is definitely true in our political system is the fact that loyalty is a key element of the political relation, much more than individual capacity to administrate or to run the country. So I would not expect to see the people governing the different states on behalf of Morena being too demanding for the López Obrador regime. Rather, they would be disciplined. And in that regard, I think it's clear that the difficulty of the current economic situation due to the pandemic does not offer the best conditions to alienate capital, foreign or national. So again, back to the question of the rhetoric being strong against capital, because this is part of what brought him to power. The actual political implementation of governing rules has been mild and will probably continue to be so.
Maybe I'm just transitioning to Armando and using the question from Lily, quite an interesting question, by the way. I encourage anyone to ask questions, and I'm trying to stream them along into the conversation. Lily works in London in one of a large investment firm company there, and looking at specifically the relation between Mexico and China, because of the series of large Chinese firms that were interested in takeovers in Mexico, not only in Mexico, by the way, in case of Ganfeng, it's also in Argentina, if I remember well, Tianqi, with small cap lithium miners in Mexico. What has been the traditional relationship between AMLO and Mexico? Just maybe first for David, and transitioning maybe on this element to Armando, to see the traditional relationship that he has with Canada and other countries, and how that has shaped kind of the mining agenda in terms of future policy. That'd be wonderful. David first, and then Armando, please.
Well, my point here would be basically that the actual economic needs posed by the fact that you are in a globalized economy will force the government to keep a mild track on foreign investment. This has happened before. We had nationalistic governments back in the 60s, for example. The administration actually nationalized the electric sector, and would probably have gone further to the left if it had been allowed. But as soon as the owners of capital realized what was going on, they put a brake on it. And President López Mateos understood clearly what was happening and softened his position more towards the center, which is, I think, what's going to happen in the next 3 years.
Yeah,
the rhetoric will still be strong.
Yeah. AMLO is as much a pragmatic and understands also the value of business in the mining sector and operating with different actors, and that means having everyone at the table. Maybe just on this, Armando, just the perception from Canadian stakeholders and the relationship of AMLO in general, also with northern neighbor the US or others. That'd be very interesting to try to see how that shapes the situation in terms of mining and what to be expected in the next 3 years.
Well, I think it's difficult really to predict how much the government will go to play the nationalistic agenda in the next months and years. I think that is dependent upon several factors. For example, one of the factors that could limit that, I would say, natural trend of a little bit becoming more radical by the government of AMLO and his political allies is the reaction of the US government in particular. How much the US government, through several means, including USMCA, the reloaded NAFTA, and other means, will defend the interests that have been impacted by some of the policies and some of the law changes, and some that are going to change like the one mentioned by David, and related to Lily's question on lithium, how much is that going to change? Well, again, I think one of the factors that will have a bearing is the US reaction. If the United States government is keen and defends the energy interests, and if defends other interests that have been affected, agricultural interests, etc., probably the Mexican government and its political allies would a little bit mitigate that natural temptation to become more radical. And becoming more radical is related to the 2024 elections. The bet would be to get as much political allies in Mexico with that type of narrative and actions. That would be one element. Then also Canada would have a say. Canada has been, I would say, basically passive in terms of defending its interests and the interests of its investors. Very little, I would say, as of this stage, but it has instruments through USMCA and CPTPP. Some of the companies, like First Majestic, have already launched cases against the Mexican government. And it's interesting to see how that would develop. Rulings against the Mexican government, just talking hypothetically, could also change and could also somehow send the messages that is not free lunch. On lithium, there has been an announcement that in the next initiative to further strengthen the state control of the electricity sector with a 54% share by the government, which is in violation of the Constitution, by the way, because the Constitution defends competition. But if that were to happen, the president has announced that he will see what he does with lithium. Now, here we enter into a more difficult situation, because if that would translate into expropriating or not current, not only Chinese, but also Canadian and UK investments on lithium, that's another issue. And by the way, on lithium, we are talking about mining assets that are not clearly the best assets regarding when you compare them with the lithium that you have in Argentina, that are of a different nature. So it's a difficult call. I think there are many things that will impact that trend. But very quickly, simply to say that anybody, and I think Ralph has been very clear on that, anybody investing in Mexico should be aware that there are tough challenges regarding rule of law, security, and in general, a culture of extortion that Luis de la Calle, a witty guy, calls extortionomics. And he has written a book about that. So there are many ways, there are many angles in which not only miners, but other investors do face some sort of obstacles to proceed with their investment. But what you learn to do is you put in place a sound set of policies that always pays off regarding a true commitment of sustainability, to work with the community and to make them true shareholders in a witty manner, on health and safety, on the integrity of doing business. So I think that always pays off. And Canada has made a contribution to raise the bar on those standards. Like, for example, the conflict-free gold standard, which is related to an integrity, a custody chain, upstream and downstream regarding your gold production, and to ensure that your production in no way violates human rights, or you start interacting with the bad guys, with the narcos or so. On operational standards, and I finish here, like embracing, as most of the gold producers do, the International cyanide management code, which is a custody change regarding management of a very delicate input for your production.
I mean, I appreciate that you mentioned a series of those, certification of best practices in ESG. I'm actually just as a side note, I think it was a month ago, we did a specific webinar on ESG certification with the World Gold Forum, the Copper Mark towards sustainable mining, that actually has stronger agreements with Mexico that explains how to do those certification, TSM being part of the Canadian Mining Association. But here, I mean, and maybe asking you one question and transitioning then to Ralph, there has been some changes in terms of policies in Mexico and some discussions right now. I mentioned and the changes in terms of royalties disbursement, whether or not it was going to be trickling down to the producing states or channeled through the federal state through the education ministry or the health ministry, which would actually really change the kind of perceived support from communities of the mining company if the royalties don't trickle down to them. Is that something that you see having a strong impact, maybe Armando, and then turn me to Ralph? How do you actually try to offset the potential risk linked to this by working more with communities and make some stand in terms of, we mentioned ESG and how you were doing this before the hour. So I'd be happy to hear that. Maybe Armando first on this royalty potential royalty reform currently on the conversation, and then to Ralph for on the ground feedback, please.
Well, in the last 8 years, for example, the Mexican government and Congress have changed the rules of the game. Like, for example, new taxes, this so-called special mining royalty, and one in addition for producers of gold and silver. And this has been challenging. And just recently, they changed the law regarding outsourcing to absurdly fully prohibit outsourcing because some players have taken fraudulent routes regarding outsourcing, but their decision was very radical. No, so they just prohibit altogether outsourcing, which is absurd. So I think we have to be aware that there will be always we are natural targets without victimizing us, but we are natural targets of a government of this nature because we are foreign investment. We are relating to natural resources that is so dear to governments that they love to be state-owned as opposed to participation of foreigners. But irrespective of that, I would say again, what always has shown to pay off is to work, for example, with the community. And if you truly work with the community and have a true presence and set up a mechanism that makes them your true partners, then they become your best shield against any forms of extortion, and they help you weather changes that may impact your day-to-day life.
Absolutely.
That would be my initial response.
And that makes it that, a jurisdiction such as Mexico, which is, structurally very pro-mining because of its history, because of its capacity, its reserves, and the so-called roots also of Mexican actors in the industry, makes it that, interesting. At the same time, a series of different challenges and unique challenges are quite strong in terms of the political party, the administration in place, but also in terms of, the extortionalism or how you want to coin it in terms of the realities on the ground. And the only ways to be able to therefore provide sustainable investments to have a safely and well-run companies and be able to highlight those because they do exist. I'm kind of opening the gate to you, like I can't do that better, by the way, Ralph. But I know a little in detail of the project in Durango, a little less in Guerrero. But if I looking at how you operate with local stakeholders, how you actually are able to make the point of developing soundly the operations. Can you give us and maybe share to other mining companies out there or investors what should be the basis of replicating good practices that has worked in those two jurisdictions in which you operate?
Sure. Let me start first by saying that mining companies in this day and age have to follow very good ESG policies, or else they don't raise money to actually move their projects forward. And as a Canadian explorer miner, we've been ever since I was involved in mineral exploration development, we have followed strong practices. But, we have to live up to world standards in development in order to be a public company and advance mining projects. So a lot of the rhetoric I hear about from government's political craziness is really just focused on finding votes and trying to change something that really doesn't need to be changed. That there's, from the Canadian perspective, working in Mexico, we and a lot of my colleagues have always followed extremely good ESG practices. And so we go into a remote area, as we did in Durango. I mean, our project in Durango was quite remote, and we embrace the local communities. We make them a part of the operation. We employ as much as possible local people, because that makes them, it's almost your capital. They become involved in the project. You work with them professionally and fairly, and they become your friends in a lot of respects. I've watched people, children grow up in Tabahueto, and we have an excellent relationship with the local communities. We consistently take our equipment and move it off of our site and fix roads up to other parts of the community and other areas. We built schools in the first school for a long, long time at Tabahueto when we were exploring, clinics, brought a doctor in, brought a school teacher in. So these are all things that don't cost a lot of money for a mining company, but pay big dividends in your community relations. So that's how we go about establishing and working to a good relationship. It doesn't happen overnight. This is something that we work on for a long period of time. And in Guerrero, same thing. That mine had been shut down for several years. The community of Arcilla, has reaped the benefits of the mine being in production before, with employment, with purchasing supplies from the community, things like that. So when it shut down, it was a very hard blow for the community of Arcilla. So when we got it back up and running, they were very happy to have it back up and running. And again, we concentrate as much as possible to buy supplies there, buy our fuels, everything that we can buy. It might cost a little bit more than going to Mexico City and buying there, but that little bit more. But the investment makes sense, yeah. Absolutely, it pays off dividends in your relationship with the local communities. Yeah. So that's how we go about it, and I'm sure that most other mining companies have similar approaches when they're working in Mexico. Because if you don't, you just don't advance, and you get into huge problems with local people and the blockade, and it just doesn't work. So we've followed those types of practices for a long period of time, and we'll continue to do so.
And on the strategy of closing down a mine, which is very drastic, but often sometimes actually a very good bet at showing what was the positive output when the project was moving forward, and be able to highlight the social inclusion to it when it's a well-run project. Because again, let's be honest, some other projects haven't been run as professionally as the one we're mentioning here, and has contributed to the poor reputation of the sector in some cases. But indeed, in the case of Mexico, and maybe turning to Adam for maybe your last contribution, maybe we'll do like a series of comments and concluding thoughts afterwards. When we look indeed at the above the ground risk that we're seeing, the need to have a very strong maybe a local content processes that make sure to highlight the anti-bribery or anti-corruption processes. There's a lot of work that we've done with the Canadian embassies in different countries, not specifically in Mexico, on indigenous communities on anti-bribery, that could be very relevant here in Mexico. How do you advise for using new technologies or new methodologies to these aspects of community relations, and therefore making those communities engage with the mining company, going beyond the narrative and working in terms of incrementally finding the basis for collaboration, and therefore protecting you from additional above the ground risk, which you still need to mitigate, obviously, but making them your allies on the field.
Okay, that's a mouthful, but
and you have 2 minutes to answer that question, to solve the issues of mining in Mexico. Here you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree with Ralph. Nowadays, companies know that they can't just play lip service to corporate responsibility or ESG, which is now the favored term as society becomes more complex and expectations and regulations. Now, I think where the challenge is beyond any of the nice rhetoric is often in mining, hard choices have to be made. You know, say when metal prices are low, production is not where it needs to be. You've got a new capital project under schedule, but at the same time, there's community complaints because the mine water is running murky or sediment full and requires work in the mines, filtration systems and whatnot. This is where rhetoric, I guess, hits reality. So, you know, first of all, companies have to be completely committed up to standards and processes, even when you know, that means hard choices. To be truly sustainable and maintain a social license, you know, one thing is to align the drivers between the different departments, operations and projects and environment and community relations, et cetera. One of the things we did while I was at First Majestic was to expand the criteria for any bonuses. You know, it's not just production and grade, but it's also no incidents, no spills, addressing community complaints on time with the grievance mechanisms, et cetera. You know, it doesn't suffice just to have the right policies and procedures, but you have to have your drivers aligned. You have to have the right people. You have to have enough of them in the areas managing these risks. One thing we're seeing in properly trained as well. You know, one thing you're seeing in mining is greater automation when you know, mostly the voices in favor of mining and what sells projects to communities, despite the impacts that are real, is employment. So increasing automation, natural tend to reduce employment. Now, this is fiercely pushed back upon by the Mexican unions, which are particularly strong in Mexico. But the reality is, you know, companies are switching resources into, you know, development, helping communities improve their local businesses to become certified contractors that would come through, you know, the supply chain area of companies. And also companies are also using technology platforms to help them manage all of these things, from social investment to their community monitoring, to their grievances, to compliance. You've got interesting providers like Isometrics or Borealis. I actually saw my colleague from Isometrics, Cecilia, on this webinar. So a shout out there. But you know, as the operating environment, the risks, the expectations of communities and governments become more complex, you know, fortunately, we also have technologies that are evolving with the needs of the sector. But at the same time, it all takes resources. You have to have people trained up on them. You have to have a commitment, and in an environment of scarcity, I think this, you know, it's, you know, there's never going to be a silver bullet, and these are always challenges that are part of doing business in the world we live in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the thoughts here, and maybe before I then turn to having that concluding thoughts, each one of you, and maybe starting with David and so on. Obviously, we also promote series of different platforms for community relations, so I'm not going to be against, you know, that idea to use the innovation and technology to do so and accompany the work that is done on community relations. Some of those are, you know, supporting employees from inside the company, reporting that has one insight. Others are maybe a little more ambitious about having much more of a bottom-up approach to kind of catching up the interest of the communities themselves and having them being the central actors. So basically them filling with information rather than the employees of the mining company having to do the reporting and so on, and therefore building on more interaction. But that each one, you know, works on a different setting, looking at where it is when you have larger communities that needs to have a larger inclusion of SDGs or inclusive development, and making the case of large mining corporation, maybe larger larger, more ambitious platform makes sense. In the others, when it's smaller communities and it's just the reporting element. I mean, obviously there are interesting options that you mentioned. I wanted maybe just to continue maybe to you, David, and what we're trying to achieve on those webinars is always trying to get different perspective. When we did something on the indigenous communities, we were in the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. When we worked on issues on community consent, Columbia University, there's always actors from the university world, NGOs or mining companies, that we have all those views. What do you see in terms of what the central term, which is the social license to operate, if I may say, on some of those projects, and above the ground risk? Are we looking at more risks in the local level against mining interests or foreign investment because of rise of criminality and rise of gangs, because of also a decreased economic situation, or maybe an improvement in terms of economic trends? And now we're looking at additional policies against mining, according to you, from AMLO. How do you want to take this in terms of concluding your thoughts, and then maybe just carrying away to each one of you some of the thoughts that you want to mention?
Look, Mexico is a country with a strong tradition in this area. And we have the resources, mineral resources, and we have fairly good experienced labor in the area. Entrepreneurial management is also good. So, and I would say basically everybody would agree that you cannot allow yourself the luxury of destroying the possibilities of development in this sector. So in spite of the fact that there is a strong rhetoric against neoliberalism and uncontrolled corporate benefits and all that, I would agree with Armando that whatever happens in the very near future will have a lot to do with the reaction of the international system as a whole, especially the US and Canada. But also you'd have to take into consideration the internal situation of the country. It is a fact that we are struggling, in spite of the happy numbers that the administration presents, we are struggling with growing unemployment and inflation. And so under those circumstances, wherever you can get revenue from, you have to use it. You cannot, how do we say in Spanish? You cannot kick the basket with the golden eggs. That would be very silly. And so I would just take up on one of the remarks I made during my first intervention. I still feel that López Obrador is more concerned with his legacy, with the historical image he leaves of his presidency, than with very radical changes in the country. So if he can survive during the next 3 years and proclaim himself as Mexico's second best president, because he's already said Juarez is the first, I think he'll be happy and leave the rest of the country alone.
So that's nice, optimistic, concluding thoughts of his happiness and leaving the sector alone for you, David. Maybe Armando, we haven't mentioned also, the issue with workers' union, other stakeholders involved in terms of Napoleon and other actors in the mining sector and shaping mining policy. I don't know if you want to bring any kind of concluding thoughts of your views from your experience from the sector, both from the industry and the Chamber of Commerce. That'd be very interesting to get your perspective.
Thank you, Remi. Yes, I think the labor front is one of the most challenging factors that will have a bearing on the mining sector. The labor law has been amended 4 times in the last 5 years. But in addition to that, Mexico did adopt very stringent and unprecedented covenants and obligations under the USMCA. In particular, a truly rigorous labor chapter with, again, unprecedented and potential trade consequences in the case that either the government and in particular companies themselves are found to be in violation of the labor rights of the workers or of the effective participation of them in the collective bargaining agreement. So we have right now a couple of cases like the change of head of the union in General Motors in Silao in Guanajuato, a case that was launched by the US government itself against General Motors. And this may have other origins, because in the end, while not so vociferous as Mr. Trump, the Biden administration also embraces this notion of make America great again. And any nearshoring regarding Asia, they would love to have it in the United States and not in Mexico or Canada. So let's be aware of that. So, but we have a case on labor regarding an alleged violation by the union of the rights of their workers, and they lost. We have another case that was launched against a company, an auto parts company in Tamaulipas, and they reached an agreement because it was a case launched before USMCA, but related to it. So I would say that we will have a greater scrutiny under the USMCA obligations, and potentially some actors in Mexico will try to exploit that in a manner that meets the formalities of a true case launched in the United States or Canada, but in reality that is being driven by them. So the best recipe, if any, for a company is to work as close as possible with the union and their workers in order to ensure that there is full compliance. And again, try to weather what I said before is almost a culture in Mexico, which is extortionomics.
I'm sure Ralph will not disagree of the argument of working closely with communities and workers in the company. But maybe do you want to share additional thoughts on this? Just closing down the panel, and I'll just finish up with Adam just afterwards for the last few words. But that'd be interesting to hear what you think our attendants and the audience should actually take out with in terms of the key one or two ideas.
Just kind of to wrap up my thoughts, I'd like to say that mining companies, exploration companies are very adaptable. And we're in a very risky business. I mean, exploration, 1 out of 1,000 projects gets to be a mine. So this capital is very important. We take risks. We know how to adapt. And, I would say governments come and go. And that's shown throughout history that changes. Things change one way, they swing left, they swing back right, they center in the middle. We just have to adapt to the current situations, which we do very well. And we continue to move forward. Mexico is a great place. I've loved working in Mexico. It's very, lots of potential for mining companies. If you can stick-handle your way through the political risk, the government risks, etc., it's a very good place to explore. So
you're already geared for 2024 onwards, when your exploration will be continuing to move forward, and for another administration.
Well, we're committed to Mexico. We're building a mine now, and we hope to bring more projects in after we get that mine up and running and the company becomes healthier. So we'll be in Mexico a long time.
Perfect. Maybe Adam, just to help me, wrap it up. We're a little bit above time on this, but I'll be happy to get your final thoughts on what should companies, investors know to be successful and sustainable in their investment in Mexico. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of Ralph's statement that 1 in 1,000 exploration projects become a mine. You got to educate the government and the communities when they're looking at the sector as the proverbial gold mine, be it gold, silver, copper, or lithium. It's high capital costs, high risks. If we all want to benefit from the wealth that can be generated from the sector, we all have to understand it and not kill the goose that lays the golden egg, but just assure that projects, mines are developed and operated responsibly.
Perfect. No, thank you very much. And so again, for people listening and people watching this video, just feel free to reach out to the different panelists and reach out to me if you want some additional information on Mexico. We're very brief in 1 hour, just trying to cover a few topics and a few recent reform for you, but there's obviously much more that could be said on this. I'd just like to finish up by, again, thanking, Adam, David, Armando, and Ralph for joining me on this panel. And I'm looking forward to future conversation in person or future Zoom conversation as we have the opportunity to do so in the next few weeks and months. Thank you very much, everyone. And I wish you everyone good end of day and good evening. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.